I still remember the morning I found out everything. My husband had moved every single dollar we saved into the hands of the woman who used to smile at me, like I was a friend. She thought I didn't know. He thought I would crumble. But instead of crying, I felt a quiet strength rise inside me. 3 days later, when his voice shook on the phone and he asked me what I had done, I already knew he was standing in the ruins of the world he built with lies, and I hadn't even raised my voice. Thank you so much for watching and for being here with me. It truly means a lot. I'd love to know where you're watching from, so please take a moment to share it in the comments below. My name is Ethel, and I live in Michigan, a place that's seen both my sweetest memories and some of the hardest nights of my life. I've learned that life doesn't always warn you before it shifts under your feet. It can look calm, quiet, steady. And then one day, the person you trusted most can turn that calm into a storm. I used to believe I had built a safe and steady home, one where trust lived in every corner, where love was something solid, something that wouldn't slip away. For years, my husband and I worked side by side, not perfect, but always believing we were on the same team. I trusted him with everything I had, not just the house or the money, but with the kind of trust that comes from giving your heart fully. That trust is why the betrayal hit the way it did. It wasn't loud. It didn't come crashing down like a wave. It crept in slowly, like a cold draft in a warm room, the kind you almost miss until it's already made you shiver. That's how I found myself staring at numbers that didn't make sense, and smiles that no longer felt honest. I didn't know then how deep it ran, how carefully he had hidden what he was doing behind a wall of smooth excuses and practiced looks. But even in that quiet moment, I felt something inside me begin to change. Not in anger, not in panic, but in a way that whispered to me that nothing would ever be the same again. When I think back on how it all began, it almost feels like a different lifetime. I met my husband when I was in my 20s, full of hope, believing that love was something strong enough to carry two people through anything. He was kind in those early years, or at least he knew how to make me believe he was. He had a way of holding my hand that made me feel safe, like the world outside could spin and fall apart, but inside our little world, everything would stay steady. We built a life brick by brick, one paycheck at a time, turning long nights into something that felt like a future. I worked hard right alongside him, never keeping score, never holding back, always trusting that we were moving toward the same dream. There were no big luxuries, but we had something I believed was even better. We had plans. Plans for growing old together, for sitting in the same house we'd paid off with calloused hands and quiet sacrifices, for passing something meaningful down. Every dollar we saved had a purpose. Every late night was supposed to be for us, not for someone else hiding in the shadows of his double life. Back then, I believed his long work hours were for the business. For us, for the future we had whispered about when the world felt bigger than our pockets. I didn't question, because when you love someone for years, questioning them feels like questioning yourself. He used to bring me small things from the office, silly stories, little jokes, and sometimes a cup of coffee when I least expected it. He'd talk about how stressful the work was, and how lucky he was to have me holding everything together at home. And I, like a fool who believed in the softness of love, thought he meant it. I didn't see the distance growing. Not at first. I didn't notice how the way he touched me changed, how the warmth in his eyes grew a shade colder with each passing season. I thought it was stress. I thought it was life weighing down on us, and so I gave him more grace than he ever deserved. Michigan winters have a way of teaching you patience. They stretch on with their quiet, with their cold, and they make you hold on to warmth wherever you can find it. I held on to the idea of us, even when the silence at the dinner table grew longer and the smiles shorter. I told myself we had been through too much to break now. I told myself I just had to hold on tighter. I thought love was about endurance, about waiting through the cold for the thaw to return. But what I didn't know then was that some winters don't end. Sometimes the cold isn't outside your door. Sometimes it's sitting across from you, pretending to love you while building a world behind your back. I can still remember the way he looked at me in those last months before everything came to light. Calm on the surface, distant behind the eyes. I thought he was tired. And maybe he was, just not from the life we shared. I didn't realize then that while I was trusting him with every piece of my heart, he was slowly pulling pieces of our life away from me and placing them in someone else's hands. And the cruelest part is, when you love someone deeply, you don't see the betrayal when it starts. You feel it as a shadow, a whisper, a shift too soft to name but too real to ignore. That's how it began, quietly, carefully, like a storm that knows it has time. And I, standing right in its path, still believed the sun would come out. It started with the smallest things, so small that most people wouldn't even notice them at first. I remember one morning I logged into our joint account just to pay a bill, something I had done 100 times before without a second thought. But that day, the numbers on the screen made me pause. The balance was lower than it should have been. Not by much, just enough to make me tilt my head and stare for a little longer than usual. I told myself there had to be a good reason. Maybe a business expense, maybe something temporary. When you trust someone for years, your first instinct isn't to doubt them, it's to excuse them. So I went on with my day, holding that little knot of unease inside me, like a pebble in my shoe. Not enough to stop me, just enough to never let me forget it was there. A few weeks later, it happened again. This time, the amount missing was bigger, enough to make my heart beat a little faster as I scrolled through the transactions. I found a transfer to an account I didn't recognize, but when I asked him about it that evening, he didn't even flinch. He smiled that easy smile of his and said it was business stuff, nothing to worry about. The way he said it was smooth, too smooth, like he had rehearsed it before I even asked. I wanted to believe him, so I nodded, but something inside me, something quiet and steady, felt that shift again, just a little stronger. The late nights at the office became more frequent. The phone he used to leave on the counter started staying in his pocket. He'd turn away just slightly when he texted, not enough to be obvious, just enough to make me feel like I was watching him through a window instead of standing right beside him. The laughter in his voice when he talked to me grew thinner, like a song that used to be full and rich, but now was barely holding its tune. I noticed how he started wearing cologne more often, the kind he used to save for special occasions. And yet, I never called him out. I didn't want to believe the man I had built my life with could be the source of the cold I felt creeping into our home. Then, there was the night he came home late, smelling faintly of something that wasn't his usual scent, a soft floral trace that didn't belong to me. He wrapped his arms around me like everything was normal, and I forced myself to stand still. In that moment, I felt like a stranger in my own house, like the walls that once kept me safe were now listening to lies I hadn't even heard yet. He kissed me on the forehead and told me not to worry so much, that things at work were just intense right now. I almost believed him, almost let myself fall back into that familiar rhythm, but the space between us was no longer something I could ignore. When trust begins to crack, it doesn't shatter all at once. It fractures quietly, thread by thread, and you try to patch it up with hope. I kept trying to convince myself that what I was feeling was just in my head. But it wasn't. It was right there, in his voice, in his distance, in the numbers on a bank statement that no longer told the story of us. And deep down, I knew something real was slipping away. Not just money, but the kind of trust that can never be replaced once it's gone. The day the truth finally came to me was quiet, almost too quiet, like the world held its breath while everything inside me shifted. I had gone to the office that afternoon to bring him lunch, something I used to do every now and then just to see his face light up. But this time, his face didn't light up at all. Instead, I saw her. She was standing far too close to him, laughing softly, touching his arm like she had done it 1,000 times before. It wasn't the laughter or the touch that hurt the most. It was the way he looked at her, the way his eyes softened in a way they hadn't for me in a long time. I walked away before he could even see me. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want to be the woman begging for answers in front of strangers. I went home, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the numbers on the bank account once again. The missing amounts weren't scattered anymore. They were gone in big, heavy chunks, like someone carving pieces out of the life I had helped build. I followed the trail of those transfers, and every step led me back to her. The same woman who used to greet me with that sweet smile at every company party, the one who always said she admired our marriage. I thought I'd break down, but something strange happened instead. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't fall apart. I felt this stillness, a quiet that wrapped itself around me like armor. It was the kind of silence that comes when you finally stop denying what's right in front of you. He wasn't just lying to me, he had already handed pieces of our life to someone else and expected me to stay blind. That was the moment I realized love wasn't what was holding us together anymore. Lies were. And I wasn't gonna let those lies finish what I had spent a lifetime building. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the house went quiet, staring at those transfer slips until the ink almost blurred. I needed someone who could see what I was seeing without trying to make it smaller than it was. So I reached out to a friend who had known me for years. Someone who had seen me at my best and at my worst. Someone who wouldn't look away. I told her everything, every detail, every number, every uneasy glance I had ignored. She didn't tell me to calm down or wait for him to explain. She looked me in the eye and said, "You already know what this is." And in that moment, I felt something lift off me. The weight of pretending it wasn't happening. She helped me gather what I needed: old statements, hidden receipts, copies of transactions I had overlooked, emails that were supposed to be private but weren't as hidden as he thought. The more I collected, the clearer the picture became. He had built a trail behind him without realizing I'd one day follow it. Every piece of paper was like a breadcrumb leading me closer to the truth he thought he had buried. My hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. They were steadying themselves with purpose. My friend reminded me that silence could be power if used wisely. That the loudest revenge isn't the one that screams, but the one that moves so quietly, no one sees it coming until it's done. So instead of confronting him, instead of crying at his feet, I placed everything in a folder. I wasn't a woman begging for answers anymore. I was a woman preparing for something he never expected from me. That night, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't just hurt, I was awake. The next morning, I woke up with a kind of calm that didn't belong to the woman I had been a few days before. It was quiet and cold, like the air before a storm, but it was steady. I got dressed, not like someone who was broken, but like someone who had made up her mind. I took that folder filled with everything he thought I'd never find and walked out the door. The air in Michigan felt sharper that day, as if the world itself was telling me it was time to stop holding on to what was already gone. I didn't call him. I didn't leave a note. I just drove to a lawyer's office and sat there like a woman who had finally decided to stop standing in the wreckage and start rebuilding. The lawyer listened carefully as I explained everything, every transfer, every lie, every smile that had covered a betrayal. He didn't interrupt, he didn't try to soften it, he just nodded slowly and told me I had more power in my hands than I thought. With every word he said, the fog in my chest began to clear. We made a plan, not the kind born out of anger, but out of precision. I gave him copies of the documents and he showed me what could be frozen, what could be protected, and how to quietly take back everything I had built with my own hands. For years I had trusted this man without ever protecting myself, believing that love was a kind of shield that would keep everything safe. But sitting in that office, I realized that love is fragile, and trust without protection can turn into a weapon when it's placed in the wrong hands. When I left the lawyer's office, the world didn't look the same anymore. The air felt heavier, but in a way that grounded me. I wasn't just a woman who'd been betrayed. I was a woman who had just learned how strong she really was. I drove home slowly, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. Not as a burden, but as armor. When I got back home that evening, the house felt different. It wasn't the walls or the furniture that had changed. It was me. I walked through those rooms with a kind of quiet power I hadn't felt in a long time. Every corner, every photograph, every worn-out rug carried pieces of a life I had worked so hard to build, and I finally saw how much of it had been carried on my back. He thought he held the control, but what he didn't understand was that everything he tried to take was something I had built with my own two hands, something I could just as easily reclaim. I set my bag on the table, opened that folder once again, and reviewed every step of the plan. It wasn't anger guiding me anymore, it was clarity. That night, I started making quiet moves. I changed passwords, updated legal documents, and followed every single instruction the lawyer had laid out for me earlier that day. I made calls he didn't know I could make, reached into parts of our shared life he never imagined I'd touch. I wasn't reckless, I was methodical. For years I had stood beside him as a wife, but in that moment, I was something else entirely, someone he'd never bothered to prepare for. He underestimated me, and that was his first mistake. Later that night, when he finally walked through the door, he didn't notice the shift. He carried himself with the same smug ease he'd worn for weeks, still convinced I was the trusting woman he could lie to with a smile. He talked about work, about how tired he was, pretending to be the man I had once believed in. I listened, not because I believed a word he said, but because I no longer needed to question him. I already knew the truth, and I already had the answers. As he moved through the house, touching the very things I had built, I looked at him and realized he didn't even see it coming. Betrayal often carries the arrogance of believing the other person is too weak to fight back. But I wasn't weak. I was patient, and patience can be sharper than any blade. I smiled politely, nodding at his little stories, letting him enjoy the illusion he'd built for himself. Meanwhile, everything he thought was his was quietly slipping through his fingers. That night, when he finally went to bed, I sat in the living room with the soft light glowing in the corner. My heart didn't race anymore. I wasn't afraid, and I wasn't broken. The woman he had betrayed had been quiet for a long time, but that quiet had turned into something he didn't recognize. He thought this was just his game. He hadn't realized I had already started rewriting the rules. The days that followed were slow but steady, like watching a storm gather quietly over calm water. I moved through that house like a shadow, not out of fear, but out of purpose. I followed the plan, piece by piece, step by step, making sure everything was done without leaving a single door open behind me. I went to the bank, signed documents, and secured accounts that once belonged to both of us, but were now firmly in my control. I froze assets he thought he could drain at will. I spoke with the lawyer again, not to ask questions, but to confirm that everything was moving exactly as it should. He had moved in silence when he betrayed me, but now I was moving in silence too. Only my steps were smarter and cleaner than his. I changed things around the house, not in ways he could notice right away, but in ways that gave me control over every inch of my own life. The locks on certain drawers, the files tucked away, the bills redirected, the papers filed under my name alone. It wasn't about hurting him. It was about taking back what had always been mine. For so long I had carried the weight of trust, the weight of belief, the weight of love, but now I was carrying something different. I was carrying power. Real, quiet, unshakable power. At night, while he went on pretending everything was normal, I sat in that same living room and watched the life around me shift. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet and deliberate, like watching roots grow underground, strong and unstoppable. He was still walking around with his chest out, smiling that smug little smile, convinced that I was still blind. He didn't know that the walls he thought he owned were already closing in on him. I didn't need to confront him. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to fight for his attention. What I was doing went far deeper than any argument could ever reach. The best part was the calm. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was living in someone else's shadow. I felt the weight of my own strength filling the room. Every silent move was a promise to myself that I would never be that trusting woman again. Not the one who ignored the signs, not the one who stood still while someone else drained her life away. This time, it was me standing tall in the dark and him walking blindly through it, not realizing that everything he thought he controlled was already gone. It was almost strange how easily everything started falling into place once the foundation beneath his lies began to crack. I didn't need to rush it. I didn't need to force it. Every step had been carefully laid out, and all I had to do was follow it. The bank accounts he thought were still open to him were frozen tight. The property papers he assumed would always include his name now carried mine alone. The money he believed would sit waiting for him like a loyal dog was no longer there to greet him. And the most satisfying part was that he didn't even know yet. He was walking straight into a storm he couldn't see, and I was the one holding the sky together. Behind every signature, behind every phone call, behind every quiet decision, there was the strength of a woman who had spent years giving everything without asking for anything back. And now that woman was no longer asking. She was taking. I flagged the transfers tied to her name, the one he thought he was clever enough to use without consequences. I filed reports, pulled legal strings he didn't even know existed, and tied every knot tight enough that by the time he reached out for what he thought belonged to him, he'd find nothing but locked doors. Each evening I watched him with a stillness that he couldn't read. He thought it was the same silence I used to give when I was trying to forgive him for coming home late, the same quiet that came from wanting to believe him. But this silence wasn't soft. It was steel. He didn't realize that every smile I gave him was a mirror reflecting his own foolishness. I didn't have to humiliate him. I didn't have to scream or throw anything across the room. My power was in the fact that he didn't even know he had already lost. There's a strange kind of peace that comes with reclaiming your life, a quiet that doesn't depend on anyone else's apology or approval. I could feel it growing stronger inside me with each step. He had played his game thinking I was standing still, but I had been building my own board piece by piece while he was busy playing in the dark. And by the time he finally turned on the light, he'd realized that every move he thought was his had already been taken away from him. That night, I sat back and let that thought settle deep inside me, like a calm tide rising steadily, without a single wave out of place. 3 days later, the silence broke in the way I had been expecting, not with a knock at the door, not with a speech, but with the sound of my phone ringing over and over. I let it ring the first time and the second, because I already knew who it was, and I wanted him to feel that cold space he had built between us closing in on him. When I finally answered, I didn't say his name. I didn't give him a soft welcome. All I heard was his voice, but it wasn't the smooth, confident voice he had used to feed me lies. It was shaking, cracked at the edges, desperate. He asked me what I had done. The way he said it wasn't like a man in control. It was like someone who just realized the ground had vanished beneath his feet. I listened quietly while he stumbled over his words, trying to piece together the wreckage he'd created with his own hands. His world was unraveling faster than he could patch it up. The accounts he thought belonged to him were out of reach. The house he assumed was untouchable wasn't his anymore, and the money he handed to her was now under investigation. Every move I had made in silence was now echoing through his life like a bell he couldn't silence. He begged for answers he never deserved. He tried to remind me of memories he thought would soften me. He spoke like the man I had once believed in. But the difference was, this time, I wasn't listening with my heart. I was listening with the quiet power he had underestimated for too long. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't let anger spill out. I just let the silence between my words do all the talking. And then, when his voice finally broke into a soft, frightened whisper, I gave him the only answer he deserved. I told him I simply matched his energy. I didn't have to explain the rest. He understood exactly what I meant. The calm in my voice was louder than any scream could have been. I could hear it in the way he went silent, like a man who finally saw the reflection of his own choices staring back at him. He thought he could break me and walk away untouched, but he had never met the part of me that refused to stay broken. After that call, the silence in this house changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't the kind of silence that hurts. It was the kind that lets you breathe again. I knew then that the life he built on lies was crumbling piece by piece, and he couldn't stop it. I didn't have to see it to know it. I could hear it in his voice, in the way every word he spoke sounded like someone trying to hold on to something already gone. The woman he trusted to keep his secrets ran the moment the money froze, and the people he thought would stand beside him started stepping away. That's the thing about betrayal. Those who play in the dark always think they're smarter than the ones they betray. until the lights come on and they find themselves standing alone. He came to the house once after that call, standing in the driveway like a man trying to find a door that no longer opened for him. He didn't step inside. He just looked at the place he thought would always belong to him. I stood by the window, watching him from a distance, not with bitterness but with a quiet strength I never knew I had. There was a time I would have opened that door, asked what was wrong, tried to fix it, tried to save something that wasn't worth saving. But that woman was gone. What stood in her place now was someone who understood that love without respect is just a rope waiting to tighten. He left that day without saying a word. The house didn't feel empty after he walked away. It felt steady. It felt like it belonged to me again, not because he gave it back, but because he no longer had the power to take anything from me. I sat in the living room for a long time that evening, letting the quiet wrap around me like a warm coat. Everything he tried to steal had already found its way back into my hands. And the best part was, I didn't have to destroy myself to get it. I simply stopped protecting the man who was never protecting me. That's when I realized real power isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it doesn't need to announce itself. Real power is when someone finally understands that they lost everything the moment they betrayed someone who gave them everything. In the weeks that followed, life began to feel like mine again. Not the version of life where I had to carry someone else's lies on my back, but one where I could breathe without waiting for the next excuse. The house felt different. Not because anything had changed in it, but because the weight of his presence was no longer hanging in the corners. I could sit in my chair at night and feel calm, without wondering where he was, who he was with, or what part of our life he was giving away. Everything he thought he could take from me was already back in my hands, and everything I lost when I trusted him blindly was replaced with something stronger, something that belonged only to me. I don't hate him. I don't love him either. What I feel is a quiet kind of peace that no apology could ever build, and no betrayal could ever break again. He taught me something without even meaning to. He taught me that silence is not weakness, it's strength waiting for the right moment. He taught me that love without loyalty is nothing but a shadow. And most of all, he reminded me that sometimes walking away with your dignity is the sweetest victory of all. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of my story. If this touched your heart, I'd love to hear where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to find your strength the quiet way. Don't forget to subscribe so we can keep sharing these moments together.